Carol Gilligan, American developmental psychologist best known for her research into the moral development of girls and women. She was born November 28, 1936 in New York City, New York, only one of these three pioneers that are still living. About Carol Gilligan. She based her theory off of Kohlberg's when she worked closely with him while teaching at Harvard. Gilligan became interested in Kohlberg's research on the moral development of children, which happened to use only boys as subjects. Gilligan decided to undertake similar research on girls, which she eventually published in a Different Voice: Psychological Theory in Women's Development, 1982. In that work, Gilligan argued that girls exhibit distinct patterns of moral development based on relationships and on feelings of care and responsibility for others. Her work soon inspired and informed a feminist-oriented movement in philosophical ethics known as the ethics of care. Her other publications include several co-authored books on moral development, psychotherapy, and race relations, The Birth of Pleasure, 2002, on love, and numerous scholarly papers. Gilligan's theory. Gilligan is known for her work with Lawrence Kohlberg on his stages of moral development, as well as her criticism of his approach to these stages. Despite being Kohlberg's research assistant, Gilligan argued that Lawrence Kohlberg's stages of moral development were male-oriented, which limited their ability to be generalized to females. Gilligan thus proposed her theory of stages of female moral development based on her idea of moral voices. According to Gilligan, there are two kinds of moral voices, that of the masculine and the feminine. The masculine voice is logical and individualistic, meaning that the emphasis in moral decisions is protecting the rights of people and making sure justice is upheld. The feminine voice places more emphasis on protecting interpersonal relationships and taking care of other people. This voice focuses on the care perspective, which means focusing on the needs of the individual in order to make an ethical decision. For Gilligan, Kohlberg's stages of moral development were emphasizing the masculine voice, making it difficult to accurately gauge a woman's moral development because of this incongruity in voices.
Lawrence Kohlberg was born on October 25, 1927 in Bronxville, New York. He died January 17, 1987 in Boston, Massachusetts as the result of suicide. He had contracted a parasite infection in 1971 while doing research in Belize. This infection led to physical illness and depression, which led to his suicide. Kohlberg's education. He graduated from Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts in 1945. He enrolled at the University of Chicago in 1948. He then held many teaching positions at other institutions and schools before he settled into a teaching position at Harvard in 1968. Kohlberg's theory. He was interested in Piaget's work on moral development of children while pursuing his doctorate. He interviewed 72 lower and middle-class white boys, presenting each with a moral dilemma. The responses of the children became the basis of his six-stage theory of moral development. Stages of development according to Kohlberg. The first two stages are considered pre-conventional. Stage 1, punishment, obedience, orientation. The use of punishment so that the person refrains from doing the action and continues to obey the rules. Stage 2, instrumental relativist orientation. The person is said to be the judge of a morality of an action based on how it satisfies the individual needs of the doer. The next two stages are conventional. Stage 3, good boy, nice girl orientation. A person judges an action based on the societal rules and social expectations before him, also known as the interpersonal relationships phase. Stage 4, law and order orientation. Respecting the authorities and following the rules, as well as doing a person's duty. The society is the main consideration of a person. The last two stages are post-conventional. Stage 5, social contact orientation. A person is looking at various opinions and values of different people before coming up with the decision of the morality of the action. The last stage, stage 6, is universal ethical principles orientation. When a person considers universally accepted ethical principles, the judgment may become innate and may even violate the laws and rules as the person becomes attached to his own principles of justice. The connections between Kohlberg and Gilgens centers around Gilgens' claim that female psychology and values, including how women come to define morality, differ from those of men. Kohlberg's model of moral development centers around the ability to make decisions based on universal, abstract principles of justice, duty, and the use of impartial reason and logic. Gilligan contended that because girls understand and define themselves more in terms of their relationships and responsibilities to others, they hold different traits as morally valuable. Women also tend to prioritize empathy over logic in their decision making. The connections between Kohlberg and Freud was pretty much Freud's difference on it. The ID, which is the self-preserving part of the mind, only focuses on what feels good regardless of the consequences. The superego, on the other hand, appears to be the moral center, which carefully considers actions before executing them, based on what the environment dictates. So they both talked about moral dilemma, but their focuses on it are different than each other.
The next psychology pioneer was Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was born May 6th of 1856. Sigmund Freud died September 23rd, 1939 by suicide. Sigmund Freud was a psychology pioneer who was deeply interested in psychoanalysis. He had considered himself a scientist, though. In 1873, he took up biology at the University of Vienna while undertaking research work in physiology. In 1881, he obtained a degree in medicine, but he was more interested in the psychological issues, so he wanted to open his own practice so he could further study these problems and look into them and determine treatment. One of the many theories of Sigmund Freud was his theory of psychological reality. Sigmund Freud identified three personas in his psychoanalytic theory of moral development: the ID, the ego, and the superego. He proposed that there was a tension between society's needs and the needs of individuals. The first persona he identified was the ID, and this is the part of our personality that includes drives and gratification. This is where we get the motivation, and when people we get gratification from this when
people reward us or saying that we're doing a good job for something. The ID is primitive, it's impulsive, and irrational unconscious that operates solely on the outcome of pleasure or pain and is responsible for instincts to sex and aggression. The second persona of his psychoanalytic theory of moral development was the ego. This is the rational part of ID that restricts the ID's desires, and it operates in both the conscious and the unconscious mind. The ego is the, quote, I that people perceive that will evaluate the outside physical and social world and make plans accordingly. The next persona he identified in his theory was the superego. The superego develops when the child identifies with the same-sex parent and makes sure moral standards are followed. It operates on the morale principle and motivates us to behave in a way that is responsible and socially acceptable. This says that the moral voice and conscience that guides the ego, when violating it, it results in feelings of guilt and anxiety. So Freud believed that the superego was mostly formed within the first 5 years of life based on the moral standards of a person's parents. It continued to be influenced into adolescence by other role models. What Freud's trying to say here is that once the child's able to repress his ID and to allow his superego to function, then moral development ensues. When this happens, the selfish desires are repressed and replace values that are more accepted by society. The basic dilemma here of all human existence is that each element of the psychic apparatus makes demands upon us that are incompatible with other two. And a conflict here is inevitable. So an example would be that the superego can make a person feel guilty if rules aren't followed. When the superego and the ID have conflicts between their goals, the ego will act as like the middle and the mediator and try to resolve the conflict. And so this can bring up different defense mechanisms to prevent it from, or them from, being overwhelmed by anxiety. One of Freud's contributions to educational psychology, he discovered the emotional nature of unconscious motivations has led to understanding the role of motivation in the aspect of the learning process. So Sigmund Freud did have somewhat of a connection to Lawrence Kohlberg. I did some research and did a lot of research and tried to find a connection between Gilligan and Freud, and it was very hard to come up with one, but there is one between Lawrence Kohlberg and Freud, which goes back to Freud's three, personas that he identified in his psychoanalytic theory of moral development, which was the ID. This is the self-preserving part of the mind, and it only focuses on what feels good regardless of the consequences. And then they both believed that the superego is the moral center, which carefully considers actions before executing them based on what the environment dictates.